Yes, Trip, we are live, so the attendees can hear us right now.
Okay. Are we ready to begin then?
Sure, I think so.
I think we have everybody. Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Trip Pollard and I'm the Vice Chair of the Board of Preservation Virginia. And I'd like to welcome you to this Preservation Virginia and Virginia Department of Historic Resources webinar on linking historic preservation and natural resource conservation. Preservationists and conservationists are increasingly recognizing the many important connections between historic and cultural resources and natural resources. And these partnerships can strengthen both fields and reveal stories and protect places that enrich our understanding of the relationships between people and the land. It's a huge topic and a very important one. So this webinar today is going to focus mainly on national heritage areas and specifically mainly on the Great Dismal Swamp. To start things off, it is my pleasure to introduce Congressman Donald McEachin. Representative McEachin was first elected to represent Virginia's 4th congressional district in the U.S. House in 2016. Among many other things, he co-founded and co-chairs the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Congressional Task Force. He's on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, the House Committee on Natural Resources, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Prior to his election to Congress, Representative McEachin served as a legislator in both chambers of the General Assembly in Virginia, and I had the pleasure of working with him on many issues. He was a stellar leader on conservation issues then as well. Among the many things he's working on currently is a co-sponsor of a proposed legislation that would direct the Secretary of Interior to assess the suitability and feasibility of designating the Great Dismal Swamp and its associated sites as a national heritage area. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Congressman McEachin, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Trip. It's like old home week. You don't look like you've aged a day since our days of running around Mr. Jefferson's Capitol. It's good to see you again, my friend.
Great to see you.
And to all of you all who have joined us today, thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation. As has been already stated, I'm Donald McEachin, and I had the great privilege of representing Virginia's 4th congressional district. You know, Virginia is home to so many incredible sites with deep historical, cultural, ecological, and environmental significance for our state and our nation. It's our job to work together to be stewards of these areas and ensure their preservation for future generations so they can learn about our history and experience these wonderful areas firsthand. Among the many important sites throughout our state is the Great Dismal Swamp, located in the Hampton Roads region of my district. I want to salute Chris Lowie, who's on this call with us. He's doing a great job with the swamp and keeping it going. I always chuckle to myself when I think about Great Dismal Swamp because while it is great, it's not nearly the 1 million acres that it used to be. It's about 1/10 of the size. While allegedly it's a swamp, it does not look like a swamp as you think about it, nor is it dismal. They're doing a really great job of keeping it up, keeping it vibrant, and I couldn't be more proud of them. What you might not know, though, is that the Great Dismal Swamp was once a home and a refuge to a generation of African American and indigenous populations who created a vibrant, self-sustaining community hidden away from the threat of enslavement. The swamp also served as an economic hub of commerce between indigenous populations, formerly indentured African American communities, and those who were escaping slavery. Due to this robust activity between these communities, the Great Dismal Swamp contains heavy concentrations of important archaeological and cultural artifacts. You didn't know this either, did you? The swamp is also one of the only known water-based stops on the Underground Railroad. Those fleeing slavery would use the swamp for cover as they traveled north to freedom. There's immense historical, archaeological, cultural, and environmental value in the region, and we must do everything we can to protect it. Despite the importance of the Great Dismal Swamp, it continues to be threatened. As I said, at one time, the swamp covered more than 1 million acres across Virginia and North Carolina. Today, it's about 1/10 of its original size, due in large part to overdevelopment and threats of climate change and sea level rise. The ever-shrinking size of the Great Dismal Swamp should be a concern for everyone, not just those of us who call the Commonwealth home. The Great Dismal Swamp has a unique and fragile ecosystem and is home to a wide array of rare animals, plants, insect species. It also plays a vital role in the continued mitigation of the climate crisis. You see, its vast ecosystem assists in the fight against climate crisis by helping to absorb harmful gases in the atmosphere that continue to drive our global temperatures up. The Great Dismal Swamp is vital to understanding our nation's history and helping to ensure a healthy future for the next generation. And that's why I have been proud to fight for its preservation ever since I came to Congress. I was proud to help lead many members of the Virginia delegation in introducing a bicameral piece of legislation to assess the sustainability and feasibility of designating the Great Dismal Swamp as a national heritage area. This legislation is an important first step in the fight to conserve the vital resources, wildlife, and historical importance of this region. Not only will its designation as a national heritage area preserve the region's integrity, it will also help stimulate the Commonwealth's economy through tremendous job creation and local economic activity. I also had the privilege and opportunity to submit a funding request to the House Appropriations Committee's consideration and possible inclusion in the upcoming appropriations process. Folks, that starts in late July, so please keep your fingers crossed, pray if you pray, but we really would like to get some federal help for the region. This funding request would provide the city of Chesapeake with the resources it needs to move and preserve the Cornland School, one of the oldest African-American schools in the Hampton Roads region. I want to salute and commend Preservation Virginia for its efforts to shine a light on the importance of the Cornland School and for including it on the list of one of the most endangered historical sites in our area. The Great Dismal Swamp is truly one of our nation's greatest historical, cultural, and environmental treasures, and the fight for its preservation continues. I'd like to extend my thanks to Preservation Virginia and the Virginia Department of Historic Resources for their continued efforts to protect endangered sites throughout the Commonwealth. Please know that I am your partner and your colleague whenever and wherever you need me. I'll continue advocating on the federal level for the swamp's preservation and look forward to our continued collaboration to protect this incredible region. Thank you for allowing me to join you today. I'm sorry that the press of business requires me to jump off the call, but I hope you all have a wonderful conversation and know that we're only a phone call away. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Representative McEachin, both for being with us today and for all that you're doing. Take care.
Take care.
No, you need to jump. All right. As I mentioned, preservationists and conservationists are increasingly recognizing the important connections between historic and cultural resources and our natural resources. Conservation easements, heritage trails, national heritage areas are just some of the tools that are being used to advance these efforts. And we have a superb panel today to talk more about national heritage areas with a focus on the recent interest in creating a NHA, National Heritage Area, for the Great Dismal Swamp, as you heard Congressman McEachin talk about a bit. In addition to our panel members, I'd also like to point out we have two DHR staff with us, Elizabeth Vehmeyer and Mark Wagner, and they're going to be on the webinar to answer any questions you might have of DHR. And just one quick housekeeping note, speaking of questions, we will take questions at the end if we have time, hopefully we'll. So please put them in the Q&A. If we don't happen to get to them today, because we have a number of excellent speakers, we will be sure to get back to you. So with that, let's turn to our panel members. I'll introduce them and they'll speak one at a time. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some questions at the end. First up, I'd like to introduce Jen Hurst-Wender, who joined Preservation Virginia in 2008 and is now our Director of Museum Operations and Education. Jen oversees the interpretation, preservation, and general operational details of Preservation Virginia's portfolio of 9 properties. And 6 of these properties are open to the public, including, I'll put in a quick plug here, Patrick Henry's Scotchtown, the John Marshall House, Bacon's Castle, Smith's Fort, Historic Jamestown, and the Cape Henry Lighthouse. And urge you all to come visit. And Jen will briefly share some information on using open space at these historic sites. Jen?
Thank you, Trip. So I know that most all of this panel is going to be talking about the Dismal Swamp, but before we get to that, I'm just going to be talking about some of the ways that Preservation Virginia's historic sites are utilizing our open space and the landscape that surrounds us. So I'm going to give a brief little overview of just some of the projects that we're involved in. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. And let's see. All right, so let's see if there we go. Okay. So the first site that we're going to kind of dive into is going to be Patrick Henry's Scotchtown. And so this is a great aerial shot of the property. And next to this, I have a map that was drawn up in the 60s, I believe 63, and it's upside down so you can see the orientation of the site. But I did want to point out that at this point, Scotchtown is in the process of developing a master plan for the entire property, so that we're not specifically focused on our historic structures, but ways that we can integrate the landscape for all of our visitors and the general public. And so we own about 23 acres around Scotchtown. Historically, we've only done the archaeology in this area closest to the work yard. And so we have so much archaeology or so much work to do, so much that's remained uncovered. We know from historical record that there were enslaved quarters on this property. We have yet to find them, so that's a goal of ours. And we also want to make sure that that we're working with Virginia Indian representatives to have a better understanding of how this land was used prior to 1717, when the original land was patented via a colonial grant to Charles Chisholm. So that just kind of gives you an overview of what the space looks like. But while we're still undergoing lots of research, we are utilizing the space in as many different ways as we possibly can. And this is really through partnerships. And everything that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of my time is all about partnerships. I think that's really the only way that we can possibly move forward. So things partnering with local 4-H groups to utilize heritage breed livestock, partnering to bring naturalization ceremonies to Scotchtown with Hanover Master Gardeners, to develop learning gardens and dye gardens, and with local entrepreneurs and businesses to bring festivals like the Beast Feast to Scotchtown. So those are very traditional ways of partnering and using the landscape that we have. And then we'll move on to Bacon's Castle. And again, here's a great aerial shot of the property corresponding with an older map. So Bacon's Castle is kind of in the same situation as Scotchtown. We have 40 acres that comes with this property, and we're looking forward to developing a master plan that's going to help us develop a plan to integrate all of that landscape in with the historic fabric that already exists. And so archaeology, again, is a major factor in how this is going to play out. But with Bacon's Castle, we are fortunate that we have this historic viewshed of farmland and forests that's pretty much been there through the 4 centuries that the structure of Bacon's Castle has existed. This original building was built in 1665, and it's pretty much been in agricultural use ever since. So one of the projects that we're working on in collaboration with Chippokes State Park is actually to do a historic road trace. And so the plan is to reopen the 3.5 mile road trail that would go from Bacon's Castle to Chippokes. And in the distance in this aerial shot back here, you can see the James River. So this gives you an idea. Bacon's Castle was not built on the water. There is a creek where skiffs could get up and down the creek, but any navigable channels would have to go to the deep water port here on the James River. And so, so we're working with the state park and landowner to see if we can reopen that road trace, which would open the property up to bike, walking, and horse trails. So definitely a partnership we're looking forward to. So moving on to another historic site that we have in Surrey, we have Smith's Fort. So Smith's Fort has this manor house that's built in the 1750s, but really the name Smith's Fort comes from a 1619 fort that John Smith began, but wasn't able to complete, that overlooks Gray's Creek. And so Gray's Creek and became part of the John Smith Water Trail, and up in the right-hand corner, you can see some representatives from the Surrey Garden Club and other folks in Surrey that were commemorating this event taking place. And so we have a water trail designation. We have a walking trail that goes from the manor house at Smith's Fort back to the fort site. And just other ways that we're also utilizing the property. The local landowner whose property surrounds Smith's Fort has been planting zinnias on our property for several years, which is a really great way that it's just bringing a lot of tourism to the site for people to pick their own zinnia flowers. Moving on to Cape Henry. So Cape Henry is located on an active military base. And we have worked in partnership with the active military base, and also the national park site has a Cape Henry Memorial National Park site. So our interpreters provide a walking tour that takes people through different areas. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a World War II era casemate, mine casemate, and that's built into the dune of the lighthouse, and working with the Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek Fort Story, we have been able to utilize that space with our interpreters to take guests through that area and look in there, and really just get an idea of how this Cape Henry area was used for the past 400 plus years. So then the last project that I want to talk about is something that's actually coming up next week. So John Marshall House in Richmond, Virginia has the least amount of property out of all of the historic sites that Preservation Virginia owns and operates. And so there's not much landscape right smack dab in the middle of downtown Richmond. However, this project is called the Freedom Constellation Project, is taking place next week, where 160-foot banners are going to go on 9th and Marshall Street. And these banners are representing a project to work towards ending juvenile incarceration. And so this project is in partnership with the mayor's office, and the Marshall House will be the main viewing station for this. This is an augmented reality project. So when we're working with landscapes, you can download the QR code on your phone, and you'll be able to see these 160-foot panels come to life with video and poetry. And so it'll kind of go up into the sky and the clouds. So this is very much a partnership that kind of dropped into our laps, but it's really a great way to tie current judicial issues back to our historic site of Chief Justice John Marshall. And so that's just a really quick sampling of some of the ways that, that Preservation Virginia sites are using our historic landscapes.
All right, thanks, Jim. Now we will hear from Elizabeth Vehmeyer, who is a program coordinator with the National Heritage Areas Program at the National Park Service in DC, along with administering financial and technical assistance to 55 of these areas in 34 sites. Excuse me. She's also working. I'm sorry, having a little technical issue here. And along with administering financial and technical assistance in 55 of these areas in 34 states, the NHA program provides technical assistance on the feasibility study process for emerging NHAs. She's also worked as an archaeologist, grants management specialist with the National Park Service, and for the American Battlefield Protection Program. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Chip. And I just want to say thank you to Preservation Virginia for the invitation this afternoon. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to give an overview of the National Heritage Area Program and what National Heritage Areas are, and a little bit about what they do, benefits that heritage areas bring to communities and the nation, and a little bit about how NHAs are designated in the feasibility study process. So first, what are National Heritage Areas? The quick answer is they're large lived-in landscapes of national importance, and they are designated by Congress. However, heritage areas are both a place and an organizational model for conservation and preservation efforts. The organizing model, which is done through a local management entity and processes there, is really grassroots, at a grassroots level. It's a community-based decision-making model with focus on interdisciplinary approaches to programs and projects. A management entity, or what we call a local coordinating entity, is designated via the legislation that creates the heritage area. And those entities can be nonprofits, state or local governments, academic institutions, or federal commissions. In the legislation that creates a heritage area, the management entity, along with kind of this partnership with the federal government, is tasked with goals of conservation, outdoor recreation, cultural and historic resource preservation, education. And then the last one I have there in parentheses, which isn't sometimes always noted in the legislation, but is a direct byproduct of the other goals and processes of a national heritage area, is economic development for that community or that region. Many NHA's activities address multiple conservation strategies in one single project. So while these are kind of called out separately, a lot of projects and programs combine them. And I can talk about a little bit more examples later on. But in general, this is a broad approach towards a large landscape. And it sometimes can cultivate new ways of seeing and learning from a landscape, from its resources, and really at the core from its people. So where are the NHAs? I noted that NHAs are not only an organizing model, but they're also a place. As Tripp mentioned, there are 55 heritage areas across 34 states in the country. They are, you can tell here from this map that they vary in size, but in general, they are a strategic assemblage of resources that allows an important interplay between the landscape and its features to tell a story. They're usually nationally distinctive landscapes, meaning This is a place, this is the best place to tell this story in America. And they can represent different eras of history or different elements of our story in America, and that can be industry, events, or people or person. So some examples in terms of telling a story of industry and how industry played across landscape includes Motor Cities National Heritage Area in Michigan, Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area in the Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania, or Silos and Smokestacks National Heritage Area in Iowa, which tells of an agricultural industry. And then you have events or kind of trends in our history, and that can relate to the transportation. So we have a bunch of canal systems that are part of the Heritage Area Program. We also have, with the first one, the first designated heritage area being the Illinois and Michigan Canal, connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. Then we also have what I mentioned was people or person. We have Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area in Central Illinois, how his life was shaped by that area. And then we also have the Gullah Geechee National Cultural Heritage Corridor along the coast there from North Carolina down to Florida, and the Gullah Geechee people and how they interacted with the landscape and how the landscape influenced them. I also encourage anyone to go onto our website and check out this map that's there, and you can see how your life has interacted with heritage areas across the country, or see maybe you didn't realize you were in one and benefited from some of the programs and sites there. So what do they actually do? How is this, how do they fulfill their legislation and their mandate from Congress? Mainly it's through a public-private partnership, which really is a model of cost-effective way to preserve these nationally important natural, cultural, historic, and recreational resources. And it's kind of through a creation of working partnerships. They expand upon traditional conservation approaches, really looking at a large-scale approach. It's community-driven. Like I noted, it's really at that grassroots level that projects and programs are developed and carried out. But at the same time, there's that grassroots and that local effort. The connection is clear with the mission of the Park Service and furthering that mission across a larger landscape than just what the Park Service owns in a park unit boundary. And part of that is, making those connections to other sites that maybe the Park Service doesn't own and manage themselves, but also helps tell a larger story of our shared heritage. And some of that is through expanding upon previously underrepresented communities, helping tell stories that maybe haven't been told previously, making connections and partnerships with groups that maybe haven't had an opportunity in the past to tell their story. It helps them, give them a platform and a space. Heritage areas also usually provide sub-grants, and that's a way to help capacity building for their networks at that local level. And that could help to carrying out certain projects like water quality, interpretation, historic preservation, signage, and brochures. I just wanted to point out here 2 heritage areas that are located in Virginia. You may be familiar with them. And so maybe that, they're a heritage area. Now I understand what they do. So you can get a sense of how heritage areas operate across the country with just these 2 examples. One, Journey Through Hallowed Ground, one of their premier projects or programs is the National History Academy, which is happening partly right now. It's usually a summer program for middle school and high school students, and which switched to virtual last year, was able to make that switch. And I think this year they're also doing some virtual programming. There's also the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District, which despite its name is part of the program in general. And they carry out battlefield preservation activities, interpretation with a visitor center at 3rd Winchester Battlefield, signage, walking tours, and events such as conferences and other research sharing events. So what don't they do? There is some confusion because they are tied to the Park Service, whether or not they are units or how they're connected to us. So Just wanted to be clear, they do not become units of the Park Service when they are designated an NHA. I did want to point out though on the right here a photo or give an example of how federal land is connected to a heritage area though. So this is Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area in northern Alabama. There is a wildlife refuge within the boundary of the heritage area, the Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge. The heritage area worked with the wildlife refuge when they were doing their planning and management planning, and how they can provide more interpretation about the Tennessee River there in this part of the state to the general public or to visitors. And so they were, you know, active participants in the planning and understanding how interpretation can be expanded. Heritage area designation does not impact private property rights, meaning there aren't regulations that come with it, meaning people, you know, can or can't do certain things with their property or have to go through some design review. That's not part of what NHAs are. Also, it does not require public access to sites or land. It's all voluntary. If you want to work with the heritage area coordinating entity to provide public access to your private property, or you know, work on other projects that may come down the pike, it's not required at all. It's just voluntary. And then lastly, I just want to mention that they don't operate from top down. And there, I mean, the Park Service isn't dictating, and we're not there every day managing what happens. It's really defined by the local coordinating entity, how we work with them and what type of assistance they may need from us. And that leads into a little bit more, but so how does the Park Service actually play into this program and what do we actually do? We are part of the public side of the public-private partnership that's created through a designation of a heritage area. And I say part because there are other public entities, right? There could be state entities or other federal agency, landowning agencies that come and play with the partnership, as I noted with the Fish and Wildlife, with the Wildlife Refuge. We offer technical assistance to existing heritage areas. They are required to do a management plan when they are first designated, so we help with that process. We can offer technical assistance across the Park Service, not just the NHA program staff, but connect to other Park Service staff members who are experts in interpretation and education, as well as resource preservation and connected conservation approach to a larger landscape. There is funding assistance that's provided to heritage areas, and the program staff do manage those cooperative agreements and that funding. And the funding there is to really develop and implement the management plan. So help them carry out those activities and those actions that are noted in the management plan. And then lastly, we conduct evaluations of heritage areas to assess their accomplishments in fulfilling their legislation and implementing the management plan and their use of the federal funding. So here, I'm not going to read all of this, but I just want to point out some benefits of heritage areas. And really, these are stats that the program gathers annually from the existing heritage areas to understand how they're using their funds, how they're supporting their communities, what networks they're partnering with at their local level. And then kind of as those buckets I noted in conservation, recreation, preservation, education, how are they how are they carrying out those types of projects? So I'll point out one example here is from South Park National Heritage Area in Colorado. They have been working on a project here at the Paris Mill site, which was for processing gold ore. It's from let's see, just want to make sure I have it right. The mill site dates back to 1874. It is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and the heritage area partnered with the State Historic Preservation Office there and applied for a grant through them to do a rehabilitation multi-year project on this site. And I here have a picture of a completed masonry work on one of the walls to show kind of the different types of actual hands-on preservation that a heritage area can also be involved in. And here the heritage area invested about $40,000 and was able to leverage up to $200,000 in a cash match. So really aiming to leverage some of that federal funding they get. Next, I'll point out another example of, here you can see stats on recreation and conservation, but also I wanted to point out one where it's a little bit more of an educational tilt and telling stories that may have not been told before, is the South Carolina National Heritage Corridor partnered with the Barbados and Carolinas Legacy Foundation. And they wanted to raise awareness of historic connections that bind South Carolina and Barbados. And so they put on special events, programs, tourism promotion to encourage exploration of sites and to see sites in a different way across the South Carolina landscape. So that's existing heritage areas, what they're tasked to do and how they're carrying out those tasks. But how do you become a heritage area? It's really a legislative process. So that means have a bill introduced, go through that legislative process of a hearing, maybe markups, have a vote, get it signed by the president eventually. So really congressional action needed. However, the Park Service can recommend steps that a community can take to kind of best be set up for becoming a heritage area. One is the completion of a feasibility study, and that involves us promoting public involvement in the planning for that, and a demonstrated widespread community involvement, not just particular, limited public, but more of a widespread community involvement in this effort. And also commitment from key constituents, stakeholders that would really play a part in helping create this network of the public-private partnership that's needed to help NHAs be successful. So the feasibility study, maybe some of you are familiar with a special resource study when a Park Service unit is proposed. It's kind of similar to that, but to assess the feasibility and suitability of an area becoming a heritage area. It's really a process to engage local people and organizations in discussing their future of their region's resources and quality of life. And, in those discussions, maybe a heritage area is one option for meeting goals of that community. And maybe it's become decided that this is the route we want to take. This is the best to carry out what we want to do for our community at that local level. And so a feasibility study would be done. It's really a means to inventory, assess, and document the nationally important resources in that area. And those resources can be tangible or intangible, but it's really trying to get a community to think about what's unique about our area, what's important, maybe what's endangered, what's underutilized, how can we help promote something or bring capacity to something that isn't there right now. It also has you look at who's going to be involved in the long term of this heritage area, and also what opportunities can be created if a heritage area is designated. And lastly, I'll just note the last bullet point here is it's a way to also identify management, funding, and sustainability strategies. So it's also a little bit about the management and business aspect of that local coordinating entity that could possibly carry this out. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention during National Pollinator Week, heritage areas also, this is an example of how heritage areas themselves have come together across the country and work. So even though they're individual and they're unique and they tell their own stories, they do come together to work on larger projects under the program. This is one example on the right from the John H. Chaffee Blackstone Valley National Heritage Corridor in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. This was an effort to create or plant a pollinator garden at a site that historically was a kitchen garden, but due to continuous flooding of the polluted river there, they didn't feel comfortable planting actual food. So they took it upon themselves, hey, this would be great for a pollinator garden. So they worked with the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society and was able to carry this project out. And then lastly, I'll just note how our feasibility studies initiated if you're interested. They can be done by local sponsors, conducted by a local organization. They pay for it themselves. They maybe get a firm or a consultant to help them carry this out. And if that's the case, then the Park Service can offer technical assistance in interpreting our guidelines for how to do feasibility studies and the criteria that we look at for the feasibility and suitability of an area. The other route is by Congress. So Congress can pass a law that would direct the Park Service to conduct the study, and then it would be a group of interdisciplinary folks from the Park Service that were tasked to do the study. And there are two of those types of studies the Park Service is carrying out right now. One is the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, and the other is the Kentucky Wildlands in eastern Kentucky. And I've provided the websites there for you to look that up to see more information on how that process is going. And I'll just leave it that note, there are multiple people in the program that are here. If you have further questions, myself and Susan Teeler in the Washington office. And then there's regional coordinators as part of the Heritage Area Program. And one is Peter Samuel, who's in the Philadelphia office, and Virginia is part of that region. And then Elisa Kuntz, who's in our Atlanta office, and North Carolina is part of that region. And there's our website and our Instagram if you want to learn more. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. And now we will go to Chris Lowie, who is the Refuge Manager at the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. Chris began working with Fish and Wildlife in 1992, has been in Virginia since 2001, and since 2007 has been the Refuge Manager at the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, one of the largest refuges in the eastern US. Chris, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Trip. I'm working on getting my presentation up here. So I'll make sure that everybody can see that. We're good to go? All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be part of this webinar showcasing the natural heritage areas and the potential for the Great Dismal Swamp landscape, the greater area of the Great Dismal Swamp, to maybe fall into one of those designations one day. So I just have a fairly short presentation here just to give you some of the highlights of the refuge. We like to say it's a refuge for wildlife and a refuge for people. And you know, many people know about the natural resource significance of the Great Dismal Swamp, and more people are starting to learn about the cultural significance of the Great Dismal Swamp. And so webinars like this have been coming more regularly, and it's great that we can help tell the story of that significance. So we'll take like I said, a quick little journey. Some of these items have been mentioned earlier, but as Congressman McEachin said, the swamp used to be 1 million acres, covering over 2,000 square miles. And so currently with the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge and the North Carolina Dismal Swamp State Park and other public access places in the Dismal Swamp, we're sitting at around about 150,000 acres. I did steal this image actually from the North Carolina Dismal Swamp State Park, their interpretive information there, but I always like this type of presentation with it. So the refuge itself was established in 1974 under the Dismal Swamp Act, and the purpose established by Congress was to protect and preserve the unique and outstanding ecosystem and protect and perpetuate the diversity of life therein. You know, Congressman McEachin mentioned it in his remarks of how unique this area is, and it's always been known as a very unique and outstanding ecosystem. Secondary purpose, of course, is to promote a public use program and provide public access to support stewardship for the area. Today, the refuge itself is 113,000 acres, and like I said, the North Carolina Dismal Swamp State Park is about 15,000 acres. There's no through roads. You cannot drive from one side, north or south, east or west, straight through the swamp. You have to drive around it. Lake Drummond is the largest natural lake in the state of Virginia. There's only 2 natural lakes in the state. It's 3,100 acres, and as you can see on the satellite imagery, it's in the middle. It's the heart of the swamp, we like to call it. And so for people that live in the Hampton Roads area, when you watch the weather on the news every night, you can often see the Dismal Swamp, and hopefully it gives you a good feeling. And the geographic positioning, when we talk about the people, when you think of Roanoke Island in North Carolina, Colonial Williamsburg, First Landing, You know, the Dismal Swamp, and again, picture 1 million acres, a lot of people, a lot of history came through the Dismal Swamp area. The comprehensive conservation plan, it was approved in 2016. It actually expires this July, but until we have a new management plan that is vetted through public comment, you know, this plan is our management plan. And it sets the management direction for us, for our natural resource protection and management, our cultural resource protection and management, while allowing public uses. And that information is all in this plan. And these three things all come together: the natural, the cultural, and you know, the public use for stewardship. So I just, you know, the abundant diversity, again, many people know about the natural resource significance. We have over 200 species of birds that have been identified on the refuge, with half of them breeding. 90 species of butterflies and skippers, the largest, highest density bear population in the state of Virginia. And so various array of wildlife, reptiles and amphibians, of course, it's a wet environment. So a multitude of natural resources that we're responsible for, rare and endangered species as well. Quickly, when we talk about habitat management, this is a forest community map that shows the different forest types. Historically, the swamp was dominated by Atlantic white cedar and bald cypress. It's now dominated by a maple gum forest in the lighter green. But we have a habitat management plan. We have priority communities that we're working to conserve, restore, and enhance. And how do we do that? We do it through forest manipulation, whether it is select logging, you know, timber harvest, hydrological restoration by slowing the drainage. I didn't put the slide in here, but we have 150 miles of ditches and roads that we inherited as a refuge that dramatically altered the hydrologic conditions of the swamp. It's drier, it drains very fast. Yeah, I won't go into those details, but we are working towards hydrological restoration by slowing that drainage, re-wetting the swamp, let the wetland be a wetland again, which has a multitude of benefits. We do a lot of forest inventory and monitoring to determine the health of our forests out there. And we do bird and other animal surveys. Again, a refuge for people. The swamp is, as I mentioned earlier, its geographical position. It's always brought the brave, the adventurous, the sheltered, escape, freedom seekers, and other communities. There's just some highlights about that. Again, these are the ancestral lands of the Nansemond Indian tribe and the McEachin tribe that lived off the land, lived on the land and lived off the land. George Washington came in 1763, saw it as a glorious paradise, but also an economic gain of logging the property for farming and also just the timber industry. Runaway slaves, maroon colonies lived out here in the swamp. Maroon being a French word for marinage, communities that lived out here on the high grounds. And this lower picture is Dr. Dan Sayers, who has conducted, I believe, 13 years, give or take, of archaeological research looking at these areas where these communities live in the swamp. What assets, what are the cultural assets we have? We have historical markers. This one here is this North Carolina state line marker was taken along a road, but these stone monuments are within a swamp. They were actually, some of them were found during the wildfires that we had about 10 years ago. While folks were out fighting wildfires, we'd see these out along the state line. And we have cemeteries on the property. We have buried railroads that, you know, we don't even know all where they are, but Hurricane Matthew in 2016 washed out one of these roads and exposed the railroad tracks that then ended up in we had to assess those tracks before we repaired this road. The buried artifacts that have been collected by Dr. Sayers and cataloged, some are in museums for this display, and some are hosted on site. And as I mentioned, Shepphard Downs, that's an asset in itself. With that, the research that Dr. Dan Sayers did and some of the history, the refuge was designated part of the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network of Freedom. So we have an educational pavilion with some interpretive information taken from Dr. Sayers' work and other documents and literature that we have. And so we're really proud of that. That was in addition to the North Carolina State Park and the Dismal Swamp Canal were all designated. I believe, from what we know, we were one of the first refuges in the country designated. Today, when I talk about public use, again, the public, we need the public to understand the significance of swamp, have stewardship to help support and promote conservation and preservation of the swamp. So we have multiple public use access points. We have driving routes, hiking routes, water routes, and we get about 65 to 75,000 visitors a year. And so we have to manage that use and ensure that, there's oftentimes we have like looters and people that want to find these old community sites and take artifacts. So again, it's a management challenge for us. So how do we bring all this together? Is the title of this webinar, Connecting Historic Preservation with Natural Resource Conservation. The way I can sum it up is every day, my staff and researchers are out on the refuge conducting field work to meet the purpose. We have multiple users, conducting wildlife observation, hunting, fishing, kayaking, research, we have construction projects. We'd like to say we're doing forest manipulation. We do have ground disturbance. Well, all of that is in very close coordination with our Fish and Wildlife Service Historic Preservation Officer that we have for the Northeast region. We conduct research projects and try to do inventory where we can. We analyze the potential impacts from any of these projects. We want to do some thinning out on the refuge, and we submit a archaeological review to our Historic Preservation Officer. We get state Historic Preservation Office concurrence on these projects that we have to do. Like I said, this picture here of the study of the railroad at Warehouses Ditch. That was at washout. And before we could dump a bunch of gravel on it, or maybe even remove the tracks, we considered to use in education. And of course, we decided to leave them and repair the road. So we get permits for all this, and we do mitigation where necessary, according to the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106. That's the last slide I have. But before I end, I do want to really thank Congressman McEachin and Elizabeth for the information that they provided about the natural heritage area. For us, the Refuge, a federal agency, we are just a stakeholder in this effort. I appreciate that background, Elizabeth, of informing everyone that this natural heritage areas are community-based. They're grown from the bottom up, which is the way things should be. And we're just one stakeholder. It's not about the refuge. It's about the landscape. We're really excited to be a part of it. And I'd like to put in a plug for the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholders Collaborative, which is a group of stakeholders interested in the natural and cultural significance of the swamp that has been brought together by the Wilderness Society. Has sort of facilitated bringing that group together. We meet twice a year, and it's really, again, just grateful to be part of a larger stakeholder group. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Nikki Bass, who is a Nansemond Tribal Councilwoman and writer at Descendants of the Great Dismal. Ms. Bass descends from families of African, Indigenous, and European origin who survived in and around the Great Dismal Swamp. And we are very pleased to have her with us today and to give us some more information about the history and culture of the swamp and her efforts to give a new voice to underrepresented narratives through her own family story. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, great. So I'd like to start by acknowledging and welcoming our Chief Earl Bass, Assistant Chief Keith Anderson, and also Lee Mitchell, who joins us from the Upper Mattaponi tribe. She is the Environmental Program Manager, and the three of them are members of our regional tribal community who work to preserve both the environment, history, and culture. I have a slide here showing the logo for my website, Descendants of the Great Dismal, and it captures a lot about my story. I am a descendant of Indigenous, African American, and European settlers in the United States. And as you see here, I'm featuring a woman, and her body is blended into a cypress tree, and she has a migratory bird in her hand. And to me, this represents my family's connection to the environment, our experience as Indigenous people being born of the land and water, as well as our experience as people of color living through labor, living through enslavement, and then living through generations of staying local, as well as migrating to other locations for opportunity. So I only have a little bit of time to share stories today, but I welcome everyone to read my site for more information. So going into our discussion of Indigenous communities around the Great Dismal Swamp, I'd like to start with a slide that I'm starting to use this a lot now. If you look at the agenda, it says Virginia Indian history around the Great Dismal Swamp. I want to scratch that and actually scratch everything we traditionally see about communities around the swamp. Early maps, like John Smith's here in the background, were made by outsiders looking in from a different language, culture, perspective of land, water, and property. Indigenous communities generally considered waterways the center of the tribal territory rather than a boundary. And land in between waterways was often shared for foraging, fishing, and hunting. So with that context, it helps to understand why the swamp would have been and still is a shared space between several significant waterways for foraging, fishing, and hunting. It doesn't belong to Virginia Indians or North Carolina Indians. It's an ancestral space that crosses over Algonquian-speaking communities like ours, the Nansemond Indian Nation, the Chowanoke community, Chesapeake, Yapam or Wampanoag, and then also Iroquoian speakers like the Nottoway, Meherrin, and Tuscarora. And this is Mosley's 1733 map. You can access it online and zoom in, and it helps you to see that for the Nansemond community, many are familiar with our settlements around the Nansemond River, but we also had settlements on the Meherrin River, the Nottoway River, and our history crosses the boundary of the state line. This is true for other tribal communities, and we want people to understand that as we develop this narrative and a vision for the swamp and the preservation of its history and culture. So looking at a timeline, we'll go back to the 1600s where many people start. That's where our written record starts, because our Indigenous languages weren't written. So most of our history is preserved orally, and the documents that you have to learn start around the 1600s with the arrival of settlers. And at that time, colonists displaced many of the tribal communities from riverfront settlements toward the swamp. The colonists had an agrarian lifestyle. They wanted good farmland. So the land that they wanted was not the land around the swamp. And for Indigenous people, we moved in that direction because we had a history surviving the swamp. We were familiar with foraging and hunting there, and we viewed it as a safe place, as Chris mentioned, a refuge to preserve our lifestyle and community as we were being displaced. Throughout the 1700s, tribes like ours, the Nansemond, Nottoway, and McEachin, shared interpreters and aligned politically against colonial encroachment. And Indigenous people also experienced enslavement and were subjected to a lot of the same oppressive laws that were developed to control all people of color. So I encourage anyone studying the history and culture of the Great Dismal Swamp to study the laws, because the laws forced people into the structures that we ended up in. And by the 1800s, many Indigenous families were of mixed ancestry, triracial, and living in endogamous communities where there was strong intermarriage and preservation of our culture and traditions. And so I wanted to show this timeline because as I started out, I am a descendant of all three of the groups that formed this story around the swamp, but I want to emphasize the importance of remembering life before enslavement as well as life after enslavement. There's so much focus on the rich history around the Maroon communities and the Underground Railroad, and I'll actually get into some examples of that within my own family. But it's so critical to maintain a perspective of the whole story so that we don't limit the value of the swamp to one period of time. I also want to emphasize again the intertribal history, the Afro-Indigenous history. This is not a place where there were just Indigenous people living alone, just African Americans living in the swamp alone, or just European settlers living alone. This is a space where communities have blended, formed relationships, and formed resilience together within the environment. And as we talk about envisioning a national heritage area, I want to share the importance of having Indigenous leadership in that effort. Earlier in the presentation, we talked about how national heritage areas are places where historic, cultural, and natural resources combine to form cohesive, nationally important landscapes. Well, the Indigenous communities in this area around the Great Dismal Swamp are living linkages between history, culture, and the environment. I've identified some of the things that we preserve as part of our culture: plants and wildlife, plants that were used as medicines, traditional ecological knowledge, cooking and culinary traditions, our languages and storytelling. There's incredible folklore around the Great Dismal Swamp that I've tried to capture in my website. And they're also, I brought them out here. I mean, there are books and books that you can get on the folklore of the swamp, which includes a lot of Indigenous folklore, as well as stories shared by other hunters and people who braved the conditions within the swamp. So storytelling is extremely important. And again, focusing on our songs, our dances, our regalia, which incorporates parts of the natural environment, and the intertribal relationships and trade routes around the swamp. And so another important reason to include the Indigenous community is that we have decades of experience engaging the public in cultural community activities. I've highlighted some images here of things we've done. We have created Yeehawkins, these are our traditional homes for members of the public to see and walk through. We've had reenactment spaces on our tribal ground, which is located at Matnocktown off of Godwin Boulevard on the northwestern border of the Great Dismal Swamp. There's also an image here of our traditional church site at Indiana United Methodist Church, and that was also the location of the Nansemond Indian Public School. I've actually worked with Preservation Virginia and Mark Wagner, who's on the call here, to nominate this site to the National Register of Historic Places. And we're hopeful that in the future, if we are able to form a national heritage area, that we can put some of these sites on a trail for people to experience, not just the wilderness and wonder within the swamp, but the culture and experiences of communities that lived around the swamp and really lived in and out. And then I have an image there of kayak launch that we have on our tribal ground. We're building a floating dock to help people have more water experiences. I also love kayaking on the Dismal Swamp Canal. And then there's an image of our powwow. We've had more than 30 years of our powwow to help people come and learn about our culture. So these are just some examples of existing activities that we have that could be built into a national heritage area and elaborated upon for more community connection. And then just going to some examples within my family of stories that can be built up to help the public and community learn. This is a series of images about one of my ancestors named Romulus Sawyer, and he was actually born enslaved in South Mills on the southeastern border of the Great Dismal Swamp. And he led 29 members of our family through the swamp in escape from their plantation to Norfolk, where he actually joined the Union Army, fought in the Civil War for his own freedom and the freedom of his family, and ended up returning back to his community, living next door to his former slave owner, and forming a legacy of leadership. And that was such an inspiration within my family that we have, and he was born in the early 1800s, but the second photo is Romulus Price, another one of my ancestors named after him. And then the third photo is my grandfather's brother, Romulus Bass, who is also named after him. So we have these incredible stories of survival of people who use the swamp to escape to freedom, but they didn't just disappear. I hear a lot of discussions about maroon communities, and I feel concerned that the story sort of stops there. I want everyone to understand that the story did not stop there. The stories continue, and there are families that have developed into, symbols of leadership, not just resilience, but leadership and accomplishment. Within our family, we have people who have become farmers, teachers, doctors, astronauts. It's incredible to look at what type of people have grown out of this community. And I also have examples of stories in my family of people who escaped through the swamp and built legacies in other states. And these pictures, you see some of our relatives who traveled through Ohio, Indiana, into Michigan. Some went as far as Canada, and I'm not sure if it's large enough to read here, but you can see in James Bass's obituary, he says that his family was born into slavery and escaped through the Underground Railroad. So I want everyone to understand, when you see these narratives about people escaping, their stories continued, and it would be wonderful to feature some of these examples of what life was like for those who stayed and what life was like for those who left. I also wanted to share some examples of Nansemond subsistence in the Great Dismal Swamp. This picture includes Chief Earl Bass's grandfather, and he was known as one of the greatest hunting guides in the region. Whenever anyone of influence, politicians, celebrities, would come to the area, they would seek out Jesse Bass as the Daniel Boone of Virginia, North Carolina, for support going through the swamp. I mean, everyone wanted to go there to hunt, but they didn't have the skills he had to navigate through the waters, through the trails. And it's an incredible legacy. We have hundreds of photos of his excursions, newspaper articles, just an incredibly rich history of that tradition. And I have the same tradition for my grandparents. The person, and the third person over there is my grandfather's brother, Kenny Bass. And this was a common tradition that they hunted, they explored, they were very proud of their ability to survive. So we look forward to a future where we may have a national heritage area and resources to preserve and elevate these stories for more people to learn them. And then lastly, one point that I'd like to emphasize, and I touched on it when I shared my logo from my website, but it's extremely important to develop underrepresented narratives like those of women who lived around the Great Dismal Swamp. I often see, because men were the legal agents at that time, there was something called coverture, where you had to be a man to own land unless you were a widow or an unmarried woman. And a lot of the written record talks about men's lives, but as we explore our personal families, we can tell the stories of women and talk about their experiences, their strength, how they dealt with the conditions living around the swamp. And in our family, one of our matriarchs is our Aunt Blanny, and she lived to be over 100 years old. And she was at that generation where she was born riding a buggy and had to learn how to drive a car. She lived her whole life on Lake Road in South Mills. And she married her husband, who's in the second photo there, who also lived his whole life on that road. And they formed churches. They lived through, incredible experiences. And actually, the earlier picture I shared of Romulus Price, he was Blaney's brother, and he fought in World War I and had incredible experiences about being, a soldier and a veteran through that period of time. So I know I don't have a lot of time. I could tell so many stories, but I just wanted to give a snapshot of several of my relatives who lived in the swamp, around the swamp. Our family land has always been described as swampland, so we weren't living within the border of the refuge that Chris did a great job of describing, but we were right there on the edge. And, in earlier times when the swamp was larger, that's how it was described in our family deeds, as swampland. We lived on Bass Lake Road, and there isn't a lake there. It was described as a lake because of how swampy it was. And another thing I'd like to share for my family is just, I love to look at their sense of fashion and pride. I don't want us to always think of people who descend from the swamp as being downtrodden and just hiding out from society. These are incredible people who had rich lives, personalities, and beautiful stories. So I thank everybody for listening, and I look forward to being able to connect more as we go down this path.
Thanks so much, Nikki, for being with us and for sharing those points and stories, and also for flagging some of those resources you held up. And I'd like to also thank Mark Wagner for the resources he's put links to in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce Eric Anthony Shepphard, who will share more about the African-American history of the Dismal Swamp. Mr. Shepphard is the president and founder of Mubita LLC and Diversity Restoration Solutions, Incorporated business, tourism, and international project development firms that are located in Williamsburg. He's also the leader for the 2019 Motherland Homecoming Project, featuring projects planned for Virginia and Zambia. And he's an author and family genealogy researcher. Eric.
Well, thank you, Trip. Can you hear me okay? I've been having a little
technical issues. You're struggling with the technology a little bit, but I can hear you just fine. Thanks.
Right. In a hotel right now, so we have some unique issues. And I'd like to thank you and, of course, Sonia for inviting me and with Preservation Virginia. I'd like to, if I could, please, I know I'm going to have to go very quickly. I don't have much time, but I am a descendant of the Grandy family out of Camden, North Carolina, Camden County there. And in doing my research, I'm originally from Baltimore. I started tracing my roots of genealogy research back in 1996, right after the Million Man March. And didn't know much about my father's side of the family. The Shepphard side did that, and then did the Grandy side, which my grandmother married a Shepphard, and her name was Elnora Grandy. And about 2001, I was down for the first time in Chesapeake, Virginia, and I was told by my father's first cousin, name was Clinton Sonny Grandy, that our people came out of Camden, North Carolina, went down there and visited, and lo and behold, as a result of that, when I got back to Baltimore, I Googled a place called Grandy, North Carolina. Up pops narrative of the life of Moses Grandy, later slave in the United States of America. That got me really involved and engaged with his story. But he was also a waterman that worked on the Dismal Swamp Canal. And if you have an opportunity to read his slave narrative, which was published in 1843, he described very vividly some of the conditions of not only people that were enslaved that were on plantations, but also our ancestors who hand dug. And you don't hear much about the contribution enslaved Africans made with the Dismal Swamp and the canal itself. That's a 22-mile stretch from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, up through Deep Creek that was hand dug by our ancestors. And Moses describes that very vividly in his narrative. The narrative is online, and you can Google Moses Grandy and you can read it if you haven't had the opportunity to do so. But it gives you more insight to the human side of what was going on there in the swamp. And we talk about terrorism. They were under tremendous horror. Our ancestors that hand dug that canal, as Moses described it, when they did not make quota, some days they were tied up to a tree and whipped, and made sure the insects got into the wounds that they had. And some of the enslaved ancestors had to take care of those who were whipped, and some of them were whipped so bad that they died right there. And I always say, well, we never read about the funeral processions going out of the swamp for our ancestors that died there. So to me, that means their bones are still there. And so that's a place that needs to be recognized, not only for the contributions, as you have $1 million yachts going up and down the Dismal Swamp Canal now that don't know about the history of how that canal was even built. We need to recognize that, and sure. And my involvement with the Wilderness Society and the Collaborative as one of its founders, leaders with Nikki Bass and Alexa Alexander from the Wilderness Society at the time. We got this started, and my goal was to make sure that African-American community is more aware of the significance of the Dismal Swamp, and we got this information, a lot of it from me, came through the Moses Grandy slave narrative, along with Dr. Dan Sayers, who's a good man, who's an archaeologist that support the Maroon community and their existence there. Those were our ancestors that escaped the Dismal Swamp. I'm sorry, not the Dismal Swamp, the plantation on the Underground Railroad, and they set up communities in the swamp. And I know they worked and associated with the Native American community and other whites as well. But I've been to Zambia in Africa, which is right next door to Angola. So a lot of them who built canals there in Zambia and kind of conditions as the swamp, they preferred to be in the swamp and be free than be on a plantation. So they contributed and they brought a lot of knowledge to this United States and the area as well. And what I did back in 2004, because everywhere Moses Grandy went after he bought his freedom, I went to and found more other Grandy relatives. Well, I also went to London, England, who published those slave narratives in the 1800s, and presented them a plaque from the Grandy family thanking them for their participation, support, and help to our ancestors that actually got out of bondage and were able to share their stories through the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society at the time. It's now called Anti-Slavery International. They still exist because the work is not complete. There's still a lot of slavery around the world that needs to be dealt with. And so as we have dealt with it, there are other families that are dealing with the same thing even unto this day. And so the work continues to free people and to make people aware how this can happen. My first experience around the Dismal Swamp, and I'm going to this short presentation to around the Dismal Swamp, was the Dismal Swamp State Park down in Camden, North Carolina. Of course, that's where Moses was born. and got a lot of information, not only about my ancestors and relatives down in a place I never heard of prior called Camden County, North Carolina, in the Dismal Swamp. They also have exhibits down there on the North Carolina side. Previous superintendent who was very knowledgeable and very good with Joy Greenwood. They were very welcoming and allowed people to get a full set of information not previously known to a lot of people about the cultures and the human history surrounding the swamp. And of course, Chris Lowie from the National Wildlife Refuge there in Suffolk, Virginia, does a tremendous job with this as well. And that's one of the exhibits there, and you can see it's Refuge from slavery. Now, part of that story is not as well known as it should be, but that's a lot of opportunity. It should be a part of the National Heritage designation, that more education and more interaction with the African American community and others as they share their narratives and some of our history large. That's the Dismal Swamp Canal, and as I said, it wasn't to this degree of dredged this wide at the time Moses was on the canal, but it was hand dug, 22-mile stretch. There were no backhoes in those days, no heavy equipment as we know it. And Moses Grandy describes very vividly the conditions that they were under and in which they had to work. And so we just want to honor and recognize those ancestors that made that contribution. And I believe during my research that the Dismal Swamp Canal is the oldest continuous operating canal in the United States. So it's a lot of history right here in not only the North Carolina side, but also up through Deep Creek in Virginia, up towards Portsmouth. This canal is beautiful, but the horrors that took place that have not been acknowledged and recognized, and some type of real memorial or recognition of ancestors, I think is one of those things that need to be considered as part of the movement forward to make this a national designation, national heritage site. They also, worked with Congressman Randy Forbes at the time. We're dating ourselves a little bit when Moses Grandy was given the honor of having a road named after him, Moses Grandy Trail. And we were there, that was in 2006, January 20th to be exact. And it was one of the ways to recognize, because Moses had his story shared with the rest of the world, Moses Grandy's story and contribution in the area. And I will end with that because I know time is of the essence, is short, and we don't want to keep people too long. But I thank you for allowing me to come in and share this information thus far.
Thank you so much, Eric. And your connection held out almost the entire way. It was only fuzzy once or twice. So glad you could be with us. And thank you so much for sharing that information and those stories. And thanks again to all of our excellent speakers today. And thanks to all of you for attending. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, a little over time, but we have I see some more resources have been put in the chat, and I think there were only 1 or 2 remaining questions. We'll send an answer to those. And also want to let you know, because one of the questions was about a recording of this. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on Preservation Virginia's website in the next few days. So thanks again to all our wonderful speakers and to everyone for joining us. This was a fantastic panel. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.